Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we are diving into a completely different kind of forensic audit. We're going to completely re-examine a massively famous piece of pop culture to unmask a huge hidden reality. So we all remember the 1998 classic The Truman Show, right? We usually think of it as this brilliant parable about surveillance or manufactured reality. But what if literally almost everyone completely missed the actual load-bearing structure of his cage?
And that brings us to our main source material. There's a popular YouTube essayist, Chase Hughes, who put together this phenomenal 46-minute deep dive into the film. About 7 minutes in, he reads this exact quote from the movie. Truman was the first baby legally adopted by a corporation. Hughes literally calls this a detail that people miss, and then he just completely moves on. I mean, for the next 38 minutes, he talks about Plato's cave, he talks about product placement, but he never once mentions the sheer weight of that single word, adopted.
So here is how we're going to unpack this whole cultural blind spot today. We'll start with the missed premise, look at the actual legal machinery, then explore the film as an adoptee study, dive into the documented delusion, look at some recent legislative victories, and finally, we'll talk about the reality of the other side. Let's get into it.
Section 1. The missed premise.
So you got to ask yourself, how does a brilliant critic spend nearly an hour breaking down cognitive dissonance and manufactured reality, yet totally ignore the literal legal instrument that built the dome in the first place? Well, it's because the premise arrives pre-neutralized. It perfectly illustrates what we call non-adopted bias. In our culture, the concept of adoption is essentially just treated as a harmless plot device, or maybe a rescue narrative. It's this ultimate architecture of silence. The audience literally hears that a company owned a human being from his very first breath, and nobody registers it as a horror story. It's just paperwork noise.
Which leads us to Section 2, the legal machinery.
Because the mechanism of Truman's captivity actually isn't some wild sci-fi invention. It is a very real state-sanctioned order. Let's forensically walk through exactly how this machinery works. First, a child is transferred. Then their prior identity is completely extinguished. A brand new birth certificate is issued, literally pretending the acquiring party birthed them. The true original record is then sealed away. And finally, money changes hands. The film just swapped out a married couple for a corporation. But make no mistake, this exact legal mechanism operates in pretty much every jurisdiction today.
And why this is absolutely crucial to understand is the sheer staggering scale of it all, $29.4 billion. Let that sink in. That is the estimated net worth of the U.S. adoption industry as of 2025. We are talking about an entire economy built entirely on this one specific legal stamp that transfers a human being.
And looking at the media representation, you can see brilliantly how that industry protects itself. Just look at the vast disparity here. 34% of mainstream coverage relies heavily on this rescue framing, right? Meanwhile, actual adoptee voices, they make up a tiny, tiny 3%. This right here is the architecture of silence made visible, and it's exactly why the audience and essayists can tune in without ever asking the hard questions.
Moving on to Section 3, an adoptee study.
So if you just restore that one variable, changing the corporation back to a family, the film immediately shifts from speculative fiction to a literal documented blueprint of the adoptee experience. The parallels are actually wild. Think about it. Truman's origin story is staged. His documents are fabricated. The people raising him are performing contracted roles. And maybe most importantly, the fear installed in him during childhood is placed exactly over the exit. For an adoptee, that fear is basically conditioning dressed up as love. It's this deep-seated idea that simply searching for the truth will inevitably hurt the people who raised you. It's gratitude weaponized as a leash.
And that fear sits exactly where the exit is. There's a famous researcher, Leon Festinger, who documented the law of cognitive dissonance way back in 1957. Basically, he found that the more a person, or a society, has paid for a belief, the more aggressively they defend it. And man, society has paid massively for the rescue narrative of adoption. So when Truman starts proposing a different reality, the immediate response is, well, everybody would have to be in on it. That like doesn't actually defeat the evidence, it just prices the truth out of reach.
Section 4. The documented delusion.
Now, this is where the system pulls off its cruelest trick. It completely inverts reality. Years after the film came out, psychiatrists actually cataloged a brand new condition. They called it the Truman Show delusion, which is where patients firmly believe their origins were staged and their documents were falsified. But now, contrast that psychiatric definition with the physical legal paperwork of adoption. For adoptees, the falsified birth certificate is a literal government reality. The sealed record is a binding statute. It's this incredibly stark paradox.
Adoptees are uniquely gaslit with the exact vocabulary of a psychiatric delusion, but it's a delusion whose factual basis they can literally pull out of a government filing cabinet.
Section 5. Legislative Victories.
So the big question is, how do you actually get out? Well, Truman doesn't just believe his way out of the dome, right? He runs experiments. He checks his way out. And for adoptees, that same method of verification is actually working. If we trace recent legislative victories, you've got California passing SB 381 to stop omitting birthplaces. You've got Virginia's HB 301 taking effect in 2026, making it the 17th state to finally restore access to original records. These victories are huge. They are literally like a boat's hull punching right through the painted drywall of the dome. The method works, the record's open.
Which brings us to our final part, Section 6, the other side.
Now, I want to slow down for a second here, because culture loves to celebrate the door opening. It's the big, triumphant movie moment. But what it completely refuses to watch is what happens after. Inside the dome, there's warmth. There's a kind of conditional safety. But when that door finally opens, the tragedy really sets in. Nobody who loved Truman inside the dome can actually follow him out. If you look at the system's perspective, like Christoph in the control room, for them to follow Truman, they would have to admit that they were the ones keeping him captured. They would have to accept that their deep concern was, in reality, the cage itself.
In the film, there's that moment Sylvia breaks character to honestly tell Truman the truth. But for an adoptee, holding on to that verified truth isn't just some simple communication tactic. It is a brutal severance. Handing over your verified truth often reveals that those relationships were completely conditional on your silence. You didn't cause the rupture, the lie caused it. But still, the isolation out there on the water, it's vast, it's cool, and it is overwhelmingly real.
Because the system doesn't just build the paperwork cage. It meticulously engineers the isolation that arrives after you leave it. It builds this mechanism to ensure that you cannot easily share your verified knowledge of the cage with the people closest to you. Going back to Festinger's law of cognitive dissonance, handing them the keys to the truth usually just makes them defend the rescue narrative even harder, and in the end, it leaves you completely blocked out.
This is the existential crisis that our culture just will not hold. The legislation doesn't magically resolve this. The ache stays. You have the documents in your hand. You have the proof. You were right all along. But there you are, standing alone on the other side of the exit, having to make this heartbreaking choice, to be alone and known rather than together and hidden.
The ultimate tragedy here isn't that there's no method to find the truth. It's that the method actually works perfectly, but the heavy cost remains totally unpaid by the system that built the dome in the first place. So leaving you with this final lingering shot, it poses a pretty unflinching question. If verifying your absolute reality guarantees your total isolation, are you truly prepared to walk through that door?